In the quiet English countryside of 1955, 60-year-old William Thompson walks slowly toward the Millbrook shooting range. His worn boots crunched softly on the gravel path that wound through the green fields. The morning sun cast long shadows across the peaceful landscape, and birds sang cheerfully in the old oak trees that lined the road. William carried an old rifle case in his weathered hands. The leather handle was smooth and worn from use of careful use. His grey hair was neatly combed back, and though his face showed the lines of a man who had seen much in his lifetime, his blue eyes held a gentle kindness. His simple brown jacket and dark trousers showed the careful patches and mends of a man who lived modestly, making every penny count. The shooting range buzzed with activity as William approached the entrance. Young men in crisp military uniforms stood in neat rows, their backs straight and their voices loud as they called out their scores. Others gathered in small groups, proudly showing off their expensive new rifles with polished metal and fine wooden stocks. The air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire and the excited chatter of men eager to prove their skill. William paid the small entrance fee to the clerk at the gate and walked quietly toward the firing line. He chose a spot at the far end of the range, away from the crowds and noise. With slow, gentle movements, he began to unpack his equipment. His rifle was old but well-maintained, its metal clean and its wood carefully oiled. Everything he did showed years of practice and deep respect for his tools. Officer James Mitchell, a proud 25-year-old with perfectly polished boots and a stern expression, noticed the elderly man sitting up at the end of the line. James stood tall and straight, his uniform pressed and his medals gleaming in the sunlight. He had recently been promoted and took great pride in maintaining the high standards of the shooting range. James walked over with confident steps, his chest puffed out with authority. His heavy boots clicked sharply on the wooden platformers. He approached William. Several other shooters noticed the officer moving and turned to watch what was happening. "Excuse me, sir," James said in a loud voice that carried across the range and made other shooters turn round to stare. "This range is for serious marksmen only. Perhaps you would be more comfortable at the beginner's range down the road. We have standards to maintain here, and I'm afraid this facility might be too advanced for someone of your experience level." William looked up from his rifle case with kind, tight eyes. Those eyes had seen much in their 60s, and they held a depth that spoke of experiences both wonderful and terrible. He had encountered this attitude many times before: the quick dismissal, the assumption that age meant weakness or inability. The young officer's words stung, but William had learned long ago that anger rarely solved anything, without arguing or showing any sign of frustration. William quietly began to pack his rifle back into its worn leather case. His movements remained gentle and deliberate, showing the same respect for his equipment even as he was being asked to leave. "Of course, young man," William said softly, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that somehow made James feel slightly uncomfortable. "I understand completely. Thank you for your concern." As William closed his rifle case and prepared to leave, most of the shooters returned to their practice. The excitement of the moment already forgotten, the sharp crack of gunfire resumed, and the men went back to their competitions and conversations about scores and techniques. But George Harris, a 40-year-old veteran who had served in the dusty campaigns of North Africa, continued to watch the old man as he walked slowly toward the exit. George stood near the middle of the firing line, his own rifle resting against the wooden barrier. Something about William troubled him deeply. Not the man himself, but the way he had been treated. George had noticed the careful, respectful way William handled his rifle, The old man's movements had been precise and practiced, showing a familiarity with weapons that went far beyond casual hobby shooting. There was something in William's quiet dignity, in the way he accepted the dismissal without protest, that stirred a memory deep in George's mind. George had seen that same respectful handling of weapons before, years ago in the trenches and foxholes of war. He had witnessed it among the men who truly understood the terrible weight of what they carried, soldiers who knew that their rifles were not toys or symbols of pride, but tools of life and death that demanded the highest respect. Daughters William disappeared down the gravel path, walking slowly back toward the village with his head held high despite the humiliation. George felt a growing certainty that they had just made a terrible mistake. The old man who had been turned away was not some amateur seeking thrills, but someone who understood weapons in a way that most of the young men at the range never would. George watched until William was completely out of sight, then turned back to his own shooting with a heavy heart, knowing that something important had just walked away from the Millbrook shooting range. That evening, George couldn't stop thinking about the dismissed old man. The image of William walking away with quiet dignity played over and over in his mind like a film reel that wouldn't stop turning. George tried to focus on his dinner, but the food tasted like cardboard. He tried to read his newspaper, but the words blurred together as his thoughts kept returning to the shooting range. Finally, George put on his coat and drove his old Ford through the narrow village streets to the local pub called the Crown and Anchor. The pub sat on the corner of High Street, its warm yellow light spilling out through diamond-paned windows onto the cobblestone road. This was where veterans often gathered in the evenings to share quiet conversations over pints of warm beer and remember old times. The heavy wooden door creaked as George pushed it open. The familiar smell of tobacco smoke and ale filled his nostrils. A fire crackled cheerfully in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the dark wooden walls, decorated with old photographs of local men in uniform. The pub was half full with the usual evening crowd, farmers finishing their day's work, shopkeepers closing their stores, and a few veterans sitting at their regular tables. George walked to the long wooden bar where Albert Morrison stood polishing glasses with a white cloth. Albert was an elderly man with silver hair and hands marked by decades of hard work. He had served in the Great War, fighting in the muddy trenches of France, and now spent his retirement years serving drinks and listening to the stories of younger veterans who came seeking understanding. Evening, George, Albert said with a warm smile. The usual pint tonight, please, Albert, George replied, settling onto a wooden stool. But I need to ask you something first. There was an old man at the shooting range today. Elderly fellow, maybe 60 years old, grey hair, gentle voice, very dignified, even when he was being treated poorly. Albert paused in his glass cleaning, his weathered face showing immediate interest. Tell me more about this man, George. George described everything he could remember about William. His careful handling of the rifle, his worn but clean clothes, his quiet acceptance of Officer Mitchell's dismissal, and most importantly, the way he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen serious action. As George spoke, Albert's face gradually went pale. The old bartender set down the glass he was cleaning with trembling hands and gripped the edge of the bar. William Thompson, Albert whispered, his voice barely audible above the low chatter of other pub patrons. Tall fellow, grey hair, gentle voice, carries himself like a soldier even in civilian clothes. Dear God, that can't be right. You know him? George asked, leaning forward across the bar with excitement and growing concern. Albert looked round the pub nervously, checking too. Make sure no one else was listening to their conversation. Then he leaned closer to George and spoke in hushed tones that wouldn't carry to the other tables. "George, William Thompson was the finest sniper the British Army ever produced during the war. He served in Burma, North Africa, and Italy. The man was a legend among those who knew about such things. They say he made impossible shots that saved entire companies of men. His commanding officers called him the Ghost because he could appear and disappear without a trace, picking off enemy officers and machine gun nests from distances that seemed impossible." George felt his heart sink into his stomach as the full weight of Albert's words hit him. "We turned away a war hero today." Albert nodded sadly, his old eyes showing the pain of memory. "But that's not the worst of it, George. William has suffered more loss than any man should have to bear. He lost his wife Mary 3 years ago to cancer. She was the sweetest woman you ever met, and William loved her more than life itself. He nursed her through 2 years of illness, never leaving her side except when absolutely necessary." The old bartender paused to wipe his eyes with his cloth before continuing. "And before that, William lost his only son David at Normandy Beach. The boy was just 19 years old. Barely more than a child. David landed with the first wave and never made it off the beach. William received the telegram while he was still fighting in Italy. He had to continue his mission for 3 more weeks before he could even properly grieve for his boy." George sat in stunned silence, trying to imagine the weight of such losses. Round them, the pub continued its normal evening rhythm, but their corner of the bar felt heavy with the gravity of what Albert was sharing. "The man carries more pain than any soul should bear," Albert continued. "Yet he's the kindest person you'll ever meet in this village. William works as a carpenter now, living in a small cottage on Elm Street. He makes wooden toys for the village, children, and fixes furniture for the elderly folk, never asking for a payment. When Mrs. Henderson's roof leaked last winter, William spent 3 days repairing it for free. When young Tommy Baker broke his leg, William carved him a beautiful wooden horse to keep him company during his recovery." George realized with growing shame that while they had been playing at being soldiers at the shooting range, showing off their expensive equipment and competing for meaningless scores, a real hero had been quietly walking among them. William had carried his terrible burdens with grace and dignity, serving his community with humble kindness while they had dismissed him as unworthy of their time. The next morning, George woke before dawn with Albert's words still echoing in his mind. He had barely slept, tossing and turning as he thought about the terrible mistake they had made at the shooting range. As the first pale light of sunrise crept through his bedroom curtains, George knew what he had to do. After a quick breakfast of toast and tea, George climbed into his old Ford and drove through the quiet village streets toward the edge of Millbrook. The morning air was crisp and clean, and smoke rose from cottage chimneys as families prepared for another day. George followed Albert's directions down Elm Street until he found a small cottage with a neat garden and a wooden workshop attached to one side. The cottage was simple but well maintained, with fresh white paint on the walls and colorful flowers blooming in the window boxes. George could hear the gentle sound of wood being carved coming from the workshop, along with someone humming a quiet tune. George parked his car and walked nervously up the stone path to the workshop door. Through the open doorway, he could see William Thompson sitting at a wooden workbench, completely absorbed in his craft. William was carefully carving a wooden horse, his skilled hands moving with the same precision George had noticed at the shooting range. The workshop was clean and organized, with tools hanging neatly on the walls and shelves lined with completed projects. George could see wooden toys, furniture pieces waiting for repair, and half-finished carvings that showed William's remarkable skill as a craftsman. Mr. Thompson. George called softly from the doorway, not wanting to startle the older man. William looked up from his work with the same gentle smile he had shown at the shooting range the day before. His blue eyes showed no anger or resentment, only a quiet kindness that made George feel even worse about what had happened. "Please, call me William," the older man said, setting down his carving knife. "How can I help you?" "Young man." George stepped into the workshop, his hands fidgeting nervously with his cap. The wooden horse William had been carving was beautiful, with flowing mane and careful detail that spoke of hours of patient work. "This is for Emma, the baker's daughter," William explained. Noticing George's interest in the carving, "She's been ill with a fever, and I thought a new toy might cheer her up when she recovers." George struggled to find the right words to begin. His throat felt dry, and his heart pounded as he tried to figure out how to apologize for such a terrible insult. "To a war hero. I was at the range yesterday," George finally said. "I saw what happened with Officer Mitchell. I asked Drown about you at the pub last night." William's hands paused in their work, and he set the wooden horse carefully on the workbench. His expression remained calm and peaceful, but George could see a flicker of understanding pass through his eyes. "I see," William said simply, his voice showing neither surprise nor anger. George took a deep breath and plunged ahead. "William, I'm terribly sorry. We didn't know who you were. Albert at the Crown and Anchor told me about your service during the war. He told me about your family, about Mary and David. I came here to apologize and to ask, would you come back to the range? Would you teach us?" William stood up slowly from his workbench and walked to the small window that looked out over his garden. Beyond the neat rows of vegetables and flowers, the peaceful English countryside stretched away toward rolling hills and distant woods. This was the land he had fought to protect, the home he had carried in his heart through years of war in distant places. "I was a sniper during the war," William said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the jungles of Burma. They called me the Shadow because I could move without being seen or heard. I made shots from impossible distances that saved companies of men from enemy machine gun nests and sniper positions." George listened in respectful silence as William continued, his eyes still focused on the peaceful landscape outside. "At Monte Cassino in Italy, I held a forward position for 3 days and nights, picking off enemy officers who were directing artillery fire at our advancing troops. I made over 40 confirmed shots during those 3 days, each one carefully planned and executed to protect our boys." William's voice grew softer, and George could hear the weight of memory in every word. "But every shot I took, George, every life I ended to save others, it stays with you. Those faces, those moments, they never leave your mind. They visit your dreams and follow you through your waking hours." George watched as tears began to form in William's eyes, though the older man's voice remained steady and controlled. "My Mary used to say I carried too much weight on my shoulders," William continued. "She was right, as she always was about such things. After David died at Normandy, I stopped shooting completely. I couldn't see the point anymore. The war was ending, and I had lost the most important thing I was fighting to protect." George stepped closer, his own eyes beginning to water at the pain in William's voice. "But, sir, your skills and experience, they could help train the next generation of marksmen, help them understand the true responsibility that comes with such abilities." William turned from the window and picked up a small framed photograph from his workbench. The picture showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes standing next to a young man in military uniform. George knew without being told that this was Mary and David. Perhaps. William whispered, holding the photograph gently in his weathered hands. "Perhaps Mary would want me to help others find their way, to teach them what I've learned about duty and sacrifice." 3 days later, William walked slowly back toward the Millbrook shooting range, carrying the same worn leather rifle case that had accompanied him on his first visit. The morning was bright and clear, with puffy white clouds drifting across, the blue sky like ships sailing through an endless ocean. Birds sang cheerfully in the hedgerows that lined the gravel path, and the air smelled of fresh grass and wildflowers this time. William was not alone. George walked beside him, matching his steady pace and carrying a sense of nervous excitement about what was to come. George had spent the past 3 days thinking about their conversation in William's workshop, and he felt honored to escort this quiet hero back to the place where he had been so wrongly dismissed. Albert had been busy during those 3 days as well. The old bartender had quietly spread word among the local veterans who frequented the Crown and Anchor, telling them about William's return and the importance of treating him with the respect he deserved. The story had traveled through the village like ripples spreading across a still pond, reaching the ears of men who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. As William and George approached the entrance to the shooting range, they could see that something had changed. A small crowd of people had gathered near the firing line, far more than the usual number for a weekday morning. There were veterans of different ages, some still wearing pieces of their old uniforms, and younger men who had heard the stories and wanted to witness this moment for themselves. Officer James Mitchell stood waiting near the entrance, but he looked very different from the proud, arrogant young man who had dismissed William 3 days earlier. His face was red with embarrassment, and his hands fidgeted nervously with his military cap. When he saw William approaching, James quickly removed his cap and stepped forward with hesitant steps. "Mr. Thompson, sir," James said, his voice shaking slightly as he struggled to find the right words. "I owe you the deepest apology. I was completely wrong in how I treated you, and I was disrespectful to a man who deserved nothing but honor. Would you please forgive me?" William stopped and studied the young officer's face carefully. He could see genuine remorse in James's eyes. Along with a newfound understanding of the mistakes he had made, the arrogance and pride were gone, replaced by humility and a desire to make things right. "James, isn't it?" William said gently, his voice showing no trace of anger or bitterness. "There's nothing to forgive, young man. You were doing your job as you understood it at the time. We all make mistakes when we don't have all the information we need." The small crowd of veterans and younger shooters moved closer as William and George walked toward the firing line. Word had spread through the village about the quiet hero who lived among them, and these men wanted to witness his return to the shooting range. Some of the older veterans recognized William from their service days, while others had only heard the stories but understood the importance of what they were about to see. William found the same spot at the far end of the range where he had set up 3 days earlier, with the same careful, practiced movements. He began to unpack his equipment from the worn leather case. His rifle was a Lee Enfield .303, the same model he had carried through campaigns in Burma, North Africa, and Italy. The weapon was old but perfectly maintained, its metal clean and its wood and stock polished to a warm glow. As William prepared his rifle, the crowd grew quiet. Even the younger men who had been chattering nervously about what they might see fell silent as they watched the deliberate way William handled his equipment. Every movement showed years of training and experience, along with a deep respect for the tools of his trade. "I want you all to understand something before we begin," William said, his gentle voice carrying clearly across the range despite its quiet tone. "Marksmanship isn't about showing off your skills or proving how strong you are. It's about discipline, respect, and understanding the weight of responsibility that comes with holding a weapon. William loaded a single round into his rifle and turned toward the targets that stood 300 yards away at the far end of the range. The crowd watched in complete silence as he raised the rifle to his shoulder and began to aim. His breathing slowed to a steady rhythm. His hands became perfectly steady despite his 60 years, and his entire body seemed to find a perfect balance. The range fell so quiet that people could hear their own heartbeats. Even the birds seemed to stop singing as William prepared to fire. With a gentle squeeze of his finger, he pulled the trigger. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the countryside, and everyone strained to see where the bullet had struck. The shot had hit the target dead center with precision that seemed almost impossible at such a distance. Without saying a word, William calmly loaded another round into his rifle. He aimed again with the same careful precision, controlling his breathing and steadying his hands. When he fired the second time, the bullet struck the exact same spot as the first, actually splitting the first bullet in half. Young James stared in complete amazement, his mouth hanging open as he tried to understand what he had just witnessed. How is that even possible? He stammered. William lowered his rifle and turned to face the crowd with a sad but gentle smile. 30 years of carrying the responsibility for other men's lives. James, 30 years of understanding that every single shot must count, because failure means good men die. From that day forward, William began teaching at the Millbrook shooting range twice a week, showing young shooters not just how to aim and fire accurately, but how to carry themselves with honor, respect, and understanding of the serious responsibility that comes with such skills. Over the following months, William became the beating heart of the Millbrook community. What had started as simple shooting lessons at the range twice a week grew into something much deeper and more meaningful. William's teachings expanded far beyond marksmanship to include lessons about character, service, healing, and what it truly meant to be a good person in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. The transformation was most remarkable in James Mitchell, the young officer, who had once dismissed William with such arrogance, became his most dedicated student. James arrived early for every lesson and stayed late, absorbing not just the technical aspects of marksmanship, but the deeper wisdom that William shared about humility and true leadership. Under William's patient guidance, James learned that real strength came not from showing authority over others, but from caring for those under his command. William taught him that a good leader listens more than he speaks, helps more than he commands, and always puts the welfare of his men before his own comfort or reputation. A rifle is just a tool. James, William would say during their practice sessions, but the man who holds it must have the wisdom to know when to use it and the strength to hold back when violence isn't the answer. The same is true for authority. Real power comes from knowing when to be gentle. As the weeks passed, James grew from an arrogant young officer into a respected leader who genuinely cared for his men. His soldiers began to trust him, and his superiors noticed the positive changes in his unit's morale and performance. William's influence extended far beyond the shooting range. He began visiting the local schools, where teachers invited him to speak to children about history and the importance of service. But William never spoke of violence or the exciting parts of war that might capture young imaginations. Instead, he shared stories of courage, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. Children who had never known war and couldn't imagine such hardship began to understand the true price of their freedom through William's gentle words. He told them about soldiers who shared their last pieces of bread with wounded comrades, about medics who risked their lives to save both friends and enemies, and about the quiet heroes who did their duty without seeking glory or recognition. Freedom isn't free, William would tell the wide-eyed children sitting cross-legged on the classroom floor. Good people have always been willing to sacrifice so that others could live safely. Your job is to make sure their sacrifice wasn't wasted by being kind to each other and taking care of your community. On quiet evenings after his teaching duties were finished, William would return to his small cottage and spend hours in his workshop. He continued carving wooden toys for the village children and mending furniture for his elderly neighbors. The careful work with his hands seemed to calm his mind and help him process the memories that still visited him from time to time. The terrible loneliness that had gripped William since Mary's death 3 years earlier began to slowly lift like morning fog disappearing in the warmth of the sun. He found new purpose in serving his community, and the grateful smiles of children receiving his handmade toys filled some of the empty spaces in his heart. George Harris became a regular visitor to William's cottage, and the two veterans would sit together on quiet evenings, sharing tea and conversations about healing, hope, and the long journey back from the darkness of war. These talks helped both men work through their own struggles with memories and loss. "You've taught us all something important, William," George said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "That true strength comes from service to others, not from showing off what we can do. You've shown us that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the small acts of kindness we do every day." When winter came to Millbrook, the village council organized a small ceremony to honor William's service both during the war and in their community. The entire village gathered in the town hall on a snowy December evening, with families bringing their children and elderly residents wrapped in warm coats and scarves. Standing before his neighbors with tears glistening in his eyes, William held the beautiful bronze medal they had commissioned for him. The medal bore a simple inscription, "To William Thompson, who served with honor and taught us the meaning of true courage." My dear Mary always told me that our purpose in life isn't found in what we've lost, but in what we can still give to others, William said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. My son David would want me to help others find their strength and learn to serve their community. You've all helped me remember that every ending in life can become a new beginning if we're willing to open our hearts to new possibilities. Years passed peacefully in Millbrook, with William continuing his quiet work of teaching, healing, and serving, when he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. The entire village mourned deeply. They had lost not just a war hero whose deeds would be remembered in history books, but a teacher, a friend, and a daily reminder that the greatest victories in life are won through kindness, service, and helping others discover their own courage and strength. The Millbrook shooting range now bears a bronze plaque mounted near the entrance where every visitor can see it. The inscription reads, "In memory of William Thompson, who taught us that true marksmanship means knowing when to shoot, and more importantly, when not to. The greatest weapon is a kind heart guided by wisdom." The end.